A military jury at Fort Hood, Texas today sentenced Army Major Nidal Hasan to death for killing 13 people and wounding more than 30 in a 2009 attack. He could become the first American soldier to be executed since 1961. The American-born Muslim has said he acted to protect Islamic insurgents in Iraq and Afghanistan. He represented himself at his court-martial but offered no defense.
He wore the uniform of a United States major. He carried the medical degree of a high-level psychiatrist. To the soldiers at one of the largest military bases in the world, he was the man you went to when your mind was broken by the horrors of war. He was a healer, a protector, and a high-ranking officer sworn to an oath of do no harm. But while he was listening to the traumas of battle-hardened soldiers, he was quietly preparing a battle of his own. On a Tuesday afternoon in 2009, this man didn't walk into the medical center to save lives. He walked in with 2 handguns and a laser sight, targeting the very men and women he had served with for years. He didn't snap, and he didn't hesitate. He used his knowledge of the human body to ensure that when he opened fire, his shots were as lethal as possible. In a matter of minutes, 13 people were dead, and dozens more were fighting for their lives in the very hallways where they once sought healing. But the truly chilling part of this story isn't just the betrayal at the heart of the massacre. It's what happened inside the courtroom. This man didn't hire the best lawyers to save his life. Instead, he fired his legal team and chose to represent himself. He didn't call witnesses. He didn't offer a defense. He sat in silence, essentially demanding that the military jury hand him a death sentence. Now, after 14 years of waiting in a cell at Fort Leavenworth, the legal loopholes have finally run out. As of 2026, he stands on the edge of history, waiting for the President of the United States to sign a warrant that hasn't been used in over 60 years. This is the story of the healer who became a mass murderer, the trial that became a platform for a martyr, and the final cold end of the man the world knows as Nidal Hasan. Nidal Malik Hasan was born on September 8, 1970, at Virginia Hospital Center in Arlington County, Virginia. His parents were naturalized American citizens of Palestinian origin who had immigrated from Al-Bireh in the West Bank. They built a modest but stable life in Virginia, operating restaurants and a convenience store while raising Nidal and his 2 younger brothers in the suburbs. The family emphasized the opportunities America offered, even as they maintained cultural ties to their heritage. From the outside, Hasan followed a classic immigrant success path. After attending Wakefield High School in Arlington for 1 year, the family moved to Roanoke, where he finished high school. Against his parents' wishes, he enlisted in the U.S. Army in 1988 at age 18. He saw military service as a practical way to fund his education. Hasan began as an enlisted soldier while taking college courses part-time. He later used the Montgomery GI Bill to support his studies and earned a Bachelor of Science degree in biochemistry with honors from Virginia Tech, graduating around 1995 to 1997. The Army continued to invest heavily in him. Hasan attended the Uniformed Services University of the Health Sciences, USUHS, the military's medical school. He completed his MD in 2003 after a 6-year program that included a period of academic probation. Following medical school, he undertook internship and residency training in psychiatry at Walter Reed Army Medical Center. The military covered the full cost of his education and specialized training in exchange for his service as an officer and psychiatrist. Hasan's role focused on treating soldiers returning from Iraq and Afghanistan who suffered from PTSD and other combat-related trauma. He listened daily to harrowing stories of war, diagnosed mental health conditions, and documented the psychological toll on service members. On paper, he appeared to be the model soldier, quiet, studious, and outwardly compliant. The institution that had shaped and funded his entire career expected loyalty and professionalism in return. Yet beneath this surface, subtle fractures were already forming. The man trained to heal the wounds of war would soon find himself ideologically at odds with the very system that had given him every opportunity. While completing his 6-year psychiatry residency and fellowship at Walter Reed Army Medical Center, Nidal Hasan's behavior raised serious concerns among supervisors and colleagues. The Army had trained him specifically to treat soldiers returning from Iraq and Afghanistan, suffering from PTSD and combat trauma. Yet, during this period, Hasan repeatedly displayed unprofessional conduct that clashed with military standards. Colleagues noted his poor job performance, including minimal work output and instances of proselytizing patients with his religious views. A 2007 memo from a supervisor explicitly warned of a pattern of poor judgment and lack of professionalism. The memo highlighted issues such as mistreating a homicidal patient and attempting to convert patients to his interpretation of Islam. Despite these documented problems, Hasan's officer evaluation reports often sanitized his behavior, framing his actions in a positive or neutral light. The most striking red flag came in 2007 when Hasan delivered a PowerPoint presentation titled "The Quranic Worldview as it Relates to Muslims in the U.S. Military." In it, he explored conflicts faced by Muslim soldiers serving in wars against fellow Muslims and suggested the Department of Defense should consider releasing them as conscientious objectors to prevent adverse events. Some instructors and peers were deeply disturbed. One colleague and one instructor each privately described Hasan as a ticking time bomb. Classmates recalled him openly questioning whether he could engage in combat against other Muslims and making statements that justified suicide bombings in certain contexts. Hasan's anti-American comments and rigid ideological positions were known within his training environment, yet no decisive action was taken. Instead of discipline or potential discharge, he was allowed to continue his training, graduate from residency around 2007 to 2009, and received promotion to the rank of major in May 2009. He was then transferred to Fort Hood, Texas, with deployment orders to Afghanistan. The military's hesitation to address these early warning signs, driven partly by concerns over political correctness and fear of appearing biased, allowed Hasan to remain in uniform. The man entrusted with healing soldiers' psychological wounds was quietly developing views that placed him in direct opposition to the institution that had shaped his career. The deaths of Nidal Hasan's parents triggered a profound personal crisis that accelerated his religious transformation. His father passed away in 1998. His mother died in May 2001 after a prolonged battle with cancer. Hasan had moved in to care for her during her final months, watching her suffer. Raised in a relatively secular household where the family ran businesses that included selling alcohol, something he later regarded as sinful, Hasan became consumed with fear for his mother's soul in the afterlife. He worried that her limited late-life turn toward faith would not be sufficient for salvation. This grief, compounded by the September 11th attacks just months later, sparked a deep identity shift. The once secular second-generation Palestinian-American began gravitating toward a more devout and eventually extremist interpretation of Islam. He turned to the Dar al-Hijra Islamic Center in Falls Church, Virginia, a prominent mosque in the Washington, D.C. area. His mother's funeral was held there, presided over by Anwar al-Awlaki, the charismatic English-speaking Yemeni-American cleric who was then viewed by many as a moderate bridge builder between Muslims and the West. Hasan was impressed by Awlaki's fluent English, engaging delivery style, and detailed knowledge of the Quran. Hasan began listening repeatedly to Awlaki's recorded sermons on CDs, which he carried in his car and tried to share with family members and colleagues. These lectures emphasized strict obedience to God, criticized compromised Western-friendly versions of Islam, and framed the U.S. war on terror as a war against Muslims. Awlaki's teachings resonated deeply with Hasan during this vulnerable period, helping shape his evolving worldview. Although Awlaki publicly condemned the 9/11 attacks at the time and was seen as moderate, his sermons planted seeds that would later align with Hasan's growing radical views. By the mid-2000s, while still at Walter Reed, the fracture in Hasan's identity had widened significantly. He openly expressed support for the other side in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Colleagues recalled him arguing that Muslims should not fight fellow Muslims and suggesting the Department of Defense should allow Muslim soldiers to be released as conscientious objectors to prevent adverse events. The man who had benefited from every opportunity the U.S. military provided was increasingly viewing America as an aggressor against Islam. What began as personal grief and spiritual seeking had evolved into a hardened ideological opposition. By late 2008, Nidal Hasan's ideological transformation had reached a critical stage. Starting on December 17, 2008, he initiated direct contact with Anwar al-Awlaki through emails sent via a messaging function on Awlaki's website. Over the following months, up to June 2009, Hasan sent at least 16 to 18 messages. In these communications, he sought religious rulings on sensitive topics, including the permissibility of jihad, whether killing American soldiers was justified, the status of shaheeds, martyrs, and the case of Hassan Akbar, a Muslim U.S. soldier who had killed 2 fellow troops in Kuwait in 2003. Hasan also asked about suicide bombings, the Islamic view on indiscriminately killing civilians in conflict, referencing Hamas rocket attacks on Israel, and even personal matters such as finding a pious wife. He offered financial help to Awlaki in accordance with U.S. law and proposed establishing a scholarship in the cleric's honor with an essay contest titled "Why Anwar al-Awlaki is a Great Activist and Leader." Awlaki responded only twice, both times regarding the essay contest, and never directly answered Hasan's religious or operational questions. The FBI's Joint Terrorism Task Force intercepted the communications. Because Awlaki was already a known subject of terrorism investigations due to his al-Qaeda links, the emails triggered review. However, the inquiry ultimately dismissed them as legitimate academic research tied to Hasan's supposed work on Muslim soldiers and counterterrorism. Investigators relied heavily on Hasan's strong officer evaluation reports and failed to connect the full pattern of his behavior. The findings were not adequately shared with his Army chain of command or security officials. By 2009, Hasan's internal conflict had become unbearable. Stationed at Fort Hood after his promotion and transfer, he openly told colleagues he supported the Taliban and Mujahideen. He proselytized patients, grew increasingly agitated about his upcoming deployment to Afghanistan, and viewed the U.S. military as the aggressor in a war against Islam. The Army psychiatrist, once entrusted with healing soldiers' trauma, had fully crossed into seeing himself on the opposite side of the conflict. The point of no return had been reached. On November 5, 2009, at approximately 1:34 p.m. Central Time, Major Nidal Hasan walked into the Soldier Readiness Processing Center, Building 4-2003, at Fort Hood, Texas. The large open facility was crowded with hundreds of soldiers receiving final medical screenings, vaccinations, and paperwork before deploying to Iraq or Afghanistan. Hasan, dressed in his Army combat uniform, carried an FN-57 pistol fitted with laser sights and dozens of loaded magazines. He also had a .357 Magnum revolver on his person that remained unused. He first approached a civilian contractor at the front desk and fabricated an emergency to move her safely out of the area, stating he did not want to harm non-soldiers. Moments later, he stepped behind the desk, bowed his head in prayer for several seconds, then stood and shouted, "Allahu Akbar." For roughly 10 minutes, Hasan methodically opened fire. He sprayed bullets in a fan-like motion across the open room, then deliberately targeted individuals. Eyewitnesses described the gunfire as rapid and continuous, sounding like an M16 rifle. Unarmed soldiers standing in processing lines scrambled for cover, hid under desks, or tried to flee. Hasan moved through the building with calm determination, aiming to maximize casualties among the deploying troops. The attack killed 13 people and wounded 32 others. 12 of the dead were soldiers. One was a civilian Army employee. Many victims were shot while waiting in line or attempting to help others. The chaos was overwhelming. Screams, the constant sound of gunfire, and desperate attempts to escape or shield the fallen. The rampage ended when civilian Fort Hood police officers responded quickly. Sergeant Kimberly Munley and Sergeant Mark Todd engaged Hasan outside the building. Munley was wounded in the hand and leg, with her knee shattered. Hasan returned fire before being shot multiple times by both officers. He collapsed, paralyzed from the waist down due to spinal injuries. The worst terrorist attack on a U.S. military installation since September 11, 2001, was over in minutes. Hasan was rushed to the hospital where he survived despite severe wounds. The shooting left Fort Hood in shock and exposed deep failures that had allowed a known risk to remain armed and in uniform. The human cost of the November 5, 2009 attack cannot be measured by numbers alone. 13 lives were violently ended inside the Soldier Readiness Processing Center at Fort Hood, and 32 others were left with lifelong physical and psychological scars. The victims represented a cross-section of the U.S. military community, different ages, ranks, backgrounds, and dreams. Michael Grant Cahill, 62, a civilian physician assistant from Cameron, Texas, had recently returned to work after a heart attack. He tried to charge Hasan with a chair to stop the attack. Major Libardo Eduardo Caraveo, 52, originally from Mexico, was a psychologist who had worked with bilingual students before re-entering military service. Staff Sergeant Justin M. DeCrow, 32, from Plymouth, Indiana, specialized in training soldiers on veteran paperwork. Captain John P. Gaffani, 56, a psychiatric nurse from California, had arrived at Fort Hood just the day before to prepare for deployment to Iraq. Specialist Frederick Green, 29, of Mountain City, Tennessee, was known for his deep faith and dedication to service. Specialist Jason Dean Hunt, 22, from Oklahoma, wanted to be part of something greater than himself. Sergeant Amy S. Kruger, 29, from Kiel, Wisconsin, had enlisted after the 9/11 attacks and was heading to Afghanistan. Private First Class Aaron Thomas Nemelka, 19, from Utah, was proud to serve as a combat engineer. Private First Class Michael Pearson, 22, from Illinois, was beginning his military journey. Captain Russell G. Seeger, 51, from Wisconsin, worked as a mental health professional. Private Francesca Velez, 21, from Chicago, was pregnant and excited about her future with her unborn child. Lieutenant Colonel Juanita L. Warman, 55, from Maryland, was a nurse and devoted mother. Private First Class Kam Si Seong, 23, from Minnesota, represented the Hmong American community serving in the Army. These men and women left behind spouses, children, parents, and siblings. Many were veterans returning to service. Others were young and just starting their careers. The 32 wounded carried not only bullet wounds, but also deep psychological trauma, nightmares, PTSD, and a shattered sense of safety on American soil. Survivor testimonies describe the terrifying chaos, the sudden roar of gunfire, desperate attempts to help the fallen, and the overwhelming fear. For years, victims' families fought bitterly for the attack to be officially recognized as an act of terrorism rather than workplace violence, a label that denied them full benefits and Purple Hearts routinely given to those injured in combat overseas. The Fort Hood community remained scarred, demanding that the 13 lives lost never be forgotten. In the immediate aftermath of the shooting, the Pentagon and Department of Defense classified the attack as workplace violence rather than terrorism. This decision sparked intense anger among survivors, victims' families, and members of Congress. It denied Purple Heart awards and full combat-related benefits to the wounded and the families of the dead, benefits routinely granted for attacks overseas. Critics argued the label deliberately downplayed Hasan's clear jihadist motive, his shouts of Allahu Akbar, and his communications with Anwar al-Awlaki. The classification deepened the sense of betrayal felt by the Fort Hood community. Hasan's court-martial began in August 2013 at Fort Hood. Charged with 13 counts of premeditated murder and 32 counts of attempted premeditated murder, he fired his legal team and represented himself. In his opening statement, he calmly stated, "The evidence will clearly show I am the shooter," and framed his actions as defending Muslim insurgents in America's war on Islam. The military judge rejected his defense of others strategy as legally invalid. Hasan showed zero remorse, called no defense witnesses, offered minimal cross-examination, and presented no closing argument. On August 23, 2013, a panel of 13 officers convicted him unanimously on all charges. 4 days later, the same panel sentenced him to death, plus dismissal from the Army and forfeiture of all pay and allowances. Deliberations on the sentence lasted under 2 hours. Nidal Hasan now resides as inmate Hasan at the United States Disciplinary Barracks, USDB, at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, the military's only maximum security prison and sole death row facility. Confined to a wheelchair due to paralysis from the waist down, he lives under strict isolation. He continues to pray 5 times daily and remains ideologically defiant. In 2014, he wrote to ISIS leader Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi requesting formal citizenship in the Islamic State and offering himself as a soldier of the caliphate. ISIS acknowledged the contact. Hasan's death sentence faced years of appeals. The U.S. Court of Appeals for the Armed Forces upheld it in 2023, and the U.S. Supreme Court denied his final petition in March/April 2025. Military death sentences require personal presidential authorization. In September 2025, after appeals were exhausted, the Pentagon began the staffing process. Secretary of War Pete Hegseth publicly declared he is 100% committed to carrying out the death penalty, calling Hasan a savage terrorist. As of April 2026, the formal request for President Trump's authorization is moving forward, the first potential U.S. military execution in over 60 years. For survivors and victims' families, this represents long-delayed acknowledgement that the attack was terrorism, not workplace violence. Yet after more than 16 years of ignored warnings, sanitized evaluations, poor information sharing, and legal delays, many question whether execution can deliver true justice or merely close one chapter in a deeper story of institutional blindness.